Johnny Carson wasn't just another late-night host. For 30 years, he was the gatekeeper of comedy, the man who could make or break a career with a single invitation to sit on his couch. Robin Williams, Joan Rivers, David Letterman, they all got that nod of approval. And once you had it, your career could skyrocket overnight. But there was one comedian who never got that blessing. One comedian who, despite building the most successful sitcom in TV history, never earned Carson's respect. Jerry Seinfeld. Now, that might sound strange at first. After all, Seinfeld was America's golden boy in the 90s. His show dominated prime time. He was hailed as a comedic genius, and he made more money than almost anyone else in Hollywood. So why did Carson, a man known for his charm, his warmth, and his uncanny ability to recognize true talent, quietly despise him? This wasn't some small misunderstanding or one-off clash. Insiders say Carson carried this distaste for years, and he wasn't shy about letting his staff know how he felt. To him, Seinfeld wasn't just another comic. He was a symbol of everything that was changing in entertainment, and not for the better. Some point to Jerry's personal life. Others say it was his arrogance, his obsession with wealth, or his dismissive attitude toward the very format Carson built his empire on. And still others believe it was something deeper, that Seinfeld's comedy, polished and technically flawless as it was, lacked the very thing Carson valued most: heart. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of Hollywood's most fascinating unspoken feuds, the Cold War between the king of late-night television and the comedian who made a show about nothing. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Johnny Carson never gave Jerry Seinfeld his blessing, and why that judgment still matters in the comedy world today. It was 1993, and Jerry Seinfeld was untouchable. At 38 years old, he wasn't just another comedian. He was the face of an entire era of television. Seinfeld dominated Thursday nights. Critics called him a genius, and he was pulling in millions of viewers each week. On the surface, Jerry had everything a performer could ever want: fame, fortune, and influence. But behind the curtain, one decision would cast a long shadow over his image, and it was a decision Johnny Carson could never forgive. That year, Seinfeld met Shoshana Lonstein in Central Park. She was beautiful, smart, and from a wealthy Manhattan family. She was also just 17 years old, still a senior at the prestigious Dalton School. What began as a chance encounter quickly turned into something more, and soon enough, the tabloids caught on. The age gap was staggering. Jerry was approaching 40, while Shoshana wasn't even old enough to order a drink legally. Seinfeld insisted in interviews that they were just friends until she turned 18. But the public wasn't buying it. Photographers constantly caught the two together in situations that looked far from platonic, and headlines spread like wildfire. People magazine ran a cover story with the not-so-subtle title, "The Graduate," a nod to the film about an older lover and a much younger partner. Newsweek published editorials questioning why a man at the peak of his fame would pursue someone so young. For Jerry, it was a personal choice. For Carson, it was a line crossed. Johnny Carson came from an older Hollywood, a world where image and reputation still mattered. He'd built his career on being the kind of entertainer parents trusted. He wasn't perfect, of course, but he represented a certain standard, a quiet sense of class. And in his eyes, this wasn't just a bad look. It was tacky, tasteless, and flat out wrong. According to insiders at The Tonight Show, Carson wouldn't even allow the relationship to be mentioned in his monologues. When a writer slipped in a passing joke about Jerry's teenage girlfriend, the audience went dead silent. Carson's reaction? A quiet order to his staff: no more Seinfeld jokes. Not about the girlfriend, not about his personal life. Nothing. To Carson, it wasn't worth it, and it wasn't funny. On stage, Jerry Seinfeld was charming. He had that smirk, that calm delivery, and the "what's the deal with" catchphrases that turned everyday observations into gold. Audiences loved it because he came across as relatable, a guy who could point out the absurdities of daily life in a way that made everyone laugh. But offstage, that was another story entirely. Those who worked with him describe a man who was almost the opposite of the character America invited into their living rooms every Thursday night. Instead of warm and approachable, Jerry was clinical, detached, and, more often than not, distant. Now, being professional isn't a bad thing. In fact, Seinfeld had a reputation for being one of the most prepared and punctual performers around. He was always on time, always had his material ready, and always delivered. But to the people working behind the scenes, the stagehands, the producers, the assistants, he kept a kind of invisible wall between himself and everyone else, and that wall didn't go unnoticed. Johnny Carson, despite being the undisputed king of late night, was famous for the opposite approach. He was a perfectionist, yes, but he treated his staff like family. He knew the stagehands by name. He'd ask about their kids, their health, even the little details most stars wouldn't care about. Johnny understood that television was a team sport, and he never forgot that his success depended on hundreds of people working together every night. So when Carson compared his own approach to Seinfeld's, the difference was glaring. Seinfeld didn't go out of his way to be cruel, but there was no warmth either. No small talk, no humility, just distance. And for someone like Carson, who'd spent decades cultivating trust with both his staff and his audience, Jerry's aloofness rubbed the wrong way. One Tonight Show writer recalled a moment that really cemented Carson's distaste. During a roundtable discussion with several comedians, Seinfeld casually dismissed peers, like David Letterman and Jay Leno, saying they tried too hard to connect with audiences. The audience laughed. Jerry's dry delivery made almost anything sound like a clever jab. But in the green room, people noticed Carson's tight smile. The laughter stopped there. Everyone in that room knew Carson hated that kind of talk. To him, dismissing fellow comedians wasn't confidence. It was insecurity dressed up as snark. And Carson, who had navigated 3 decades of cutthroat television without making enemies, believed that kind of arrogance was both unnecessary and dangerous. As one insider later put it, Johnny liked comedians who had layers. Wit, yes, but also humility, authenticity, the ability to laugh at themselves. Jerry had the wit. The rest, not so much. That's what struck Carson most, the lack of humanity. Jerry seemed to believe that his success spoke for itself, that just showing up was enough. But to Johnny, real greatness wasn't just about being funny on stage. It was about how you carried yourself when the cameras weren't rolling. And as Carson saw it, Seinfeld failed that test. But the clash between them wasn't only about personality. It also came down to something even bigger, how each man viewed wealth, fame, and what it meant to be successful. And in that arena, the gap between Carson and Seinfeld was even more obvious, and even more personal. If there was one thing that truly highlighted the gulf between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld, it was their attitudes toward money and fame. Carson was, without question, one of the richest entertainers of his time. At the peak of his career, he was pulling in more than anyone else on television. By the end of his run, his fortune was estimated at hundreds of millions, and yet, you wouldn't know it if you saw him out in public. Johnny lived comfortably, sure. He had nice cars, beautiful homes, and access to luxuries that most people could only dream of. But he never flaunted it. He hated talking about money in interviews, and to him, bragging about wealth was almost vulgar. Carson's philosophy came from his roots, growing up during the Depression in Nebraska, where hard work and humility were ingrained in everyday life. Even after becoming the king of late night, he carried that Midwestern sensibility with him. One longtime producer remembered it perfectly. Johnny drove nice cars, but he never talked about them. He'd show up, do his work, treat people with respect, and go home. To him, flaunting money was the quickest way to lose touch with your audience, and then there was Jerry Seinfeld. After his sitcom ended, Jerry's identity seemed to revolve around wealth. The press constantly reported on his massive syndication checks. At one point, he was making nearly $100 million a year from reruns alone. But instead of keeping it quiet, Jerry leaned into it. His passion for cars became part of his public image. He reportedly collected over 100 Porsches, and his show, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, was built entirely around that luxury lifestyle. Where Carson saw money as something private, Seinfeld seemed to revel in displaying it. His cars, his jet setting, his massive New York apartment, it was all out in the open. For Carson, this wasn't just a generational difference. It was a red flag. Johnny once told a writer on The Tonight Show, "You don't get funnier when your garage gets bigger." To him, comedy came from struggle, from everyday life, from observing the quirks of ordinary people. When a comedian got too far removed from that reality, when they were living in private jets and billion-dollar penthouses, Carson believed they lost the very thing that made them relatable. And in his eyes, that's exactly what happened to Jerry. Fans might have admired Seinfeld's cars and wealth, but to Carson, it was proof that Jerry had lost touch with the people who made him successful. "The audience can smell it when you're out of touch," Carson once told his longtime sidekick, Ed McMahon. "And when that happens, you stop being funny. You're just rich." That was Carson's ultimate criticism, and it wasn't just about Jerry. It was about what celebrity culture was becoming. In Johnny's day, the greatest comedians, George Burns, Bob Hope, Jack Benny, never let their wealth overshadow their everyman appeal. They understood that their job was to connect with audiences, not distance themselves from them. To Carson, Seinfeld represented a new kind of comedian, one who flaunted the trappings of success rather than hiding them, one who turned wealth into a punchline instead of digging into the real struggles of life. And to a man who believed comedy should unite people, Jerry's approach felt like the opposite. But things didn't stop there. The divide between them became even sharper when Seinfeld openly criticized the very format Johnny Carson had spent his life perfecting, the late-night talk show. And that was personal. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson perfected a format that would define late-night television forever. The monologue, the desk, the couch, the interviews. It looked simple, but it wasn't. Carson turned it into an art form, a nightly conversation with America that shaped the careers of countless comedians and comforted audiences through wars, scandals, and national tragedies. This wasn't just entertainment to Johnny. To him, the talk show was America's town square. It was a place where the entire country could gather, laugh, and feel connected, even if just for an hour each night. And Carson guarded that legacy fiercely. So, when Jerry Seinfeld began dismissing the traditional talk show model, Carson took it as a direct insult. In 2012, Jerry launched Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. It was positioned as a fresh, modern alternative to late-night interviews. No desk, no studio audience, no formality. Just Seinfeld driving a luxury car with another comic, sipping coffee, and chatting. The problem wasn't the show itself. It was how Jerry framed it. In multiple interviews promoting the series, he made a point of separating his project from the traditional talk show style. "I don't want to interview actors about movies I haven't seen," Jerry said. "I'm not interested in fake enthusiasm, that pretend interest. That's why this is the only show worth doing. It's real." He never mentioned Carson by name. But to insiders, the implication was crystal clear. The talk show format, Carson's format, was outdated, fake, and irrelevant. To Johnny, who spent his entire career proving that the talk show mattered, this wasn't just criticism. It was a rejection of his life's work. A close friend of Carson's later revealed, Johnny was sensitive about his legacy. Always had been. When Jerry implied that the traditional format was phony, it cut deep. He felt like here was a guy who wouldn't even have a career without the Tonight Show platform, turning around and acting like the format was beneath him. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Seinfeld's early appearances on The Tonight Show were crucial in getting him noticed by a national audience. Carson's approval had helped launch Jerry's career. Yet years later, Jerry was essentially saying that the talk show model was outdated nonsense. For Carson, it wasn't just ungrateful, it was disrespectful. One NBC executive put it bluntly, Johnny believed the talk show was about connecting with America. It was bigger than ratings, bigger than celebrity. So when Jerry brushed it off as fake, it wasn't just criticism of the format. It felt like he was dismissing Johnny himself. Carson reportedly quipped about it in retirement, in that classic understated way. When told about Jerry's comments, he simply said, "I guess Jerry doesn't realize that without talk shows, he'd still be performing in pizza parlors in Long Island." The delivery was light, but beneath the joke, the sting was real. For Johnny Carson, comedy was never just about laughter. Yes, it had to be funny, sharp, clever, entertaining. But the best comedy, in his eyes, went further. It pulled back the curtain on the human experience. It made you laugh while also making you feel something deeper: recognition, discomfort, even healing. And that's why Carson gravitated toward comics like Richard Pryor, George Carlin, and Robin Williams. Richard Pryor stood on stage and spoke openly about race, addiction, and pain. His comedy was raw, even messy at times, but it was honest. Audiences didn't just laugh, they saw themselves in his struggles. George Carlin used humor as a weapon, challenging authority and exposing the absurdities of politics and society. Robin Williams? He was a tornado of energy, hilarious one second and heartbreakingly vulnerable the next. These were the comedians Carson adored, the ones he invited back again and again. Not just because they made people laugh, but because they revealed truth through laughter. Jerry Seinfeld was different. From the very beginning, Jerry made it clear his comedy would not touch politics, pain, or personal struggle. His motto was simple: "I'm not interested in feelings. I'm interested in funny." For him, humor lived on the surface of everyday life. Socks in the dryer, airline food, parking spaces. Polished, relatable, technically flawless, but emotionally empty. Carson could respect Jerry's precision. He understood the skill it took to craft that kind of universal observational humor, but he also felt that it missed something essential. To him, Jerry's comedy was like a beautiful painting with no depth. You admired it, but you didn't take it with you when you left the room. A longtime Carson confidant explained it this way: "Johnny believed the great ones made you laugh until you thought. Jerry never did that. His comedy never dug into the deeper waters where the real treasures are found." And Carson knew those waters well. He had endured public divorces, the tragic death of his son, and his own battles with alcohol. He believed that comedy wasn't just an escape from life's difficulties. It was a way to transform them, to help others feel less alone. That's why he respected comics who put their scars on display. Jerry, on the other hand, seemed determined to keep everything neat, polished, and free of emotion. No politics, no vulnerability, no pain, just jokes about nothing. For Carson, that wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was almost a betrayal of what comedy could be. When asked late in life about the difference between good comedians and great ones, Johnny said, "There are comedians who make you laugh until you cry, and then there are comedians who make you laugh until you think. The great ones do both. I'm still waiting for Jerry to make me think." That single line summed up everything. Carson didn't hate Jerry for being successful. He didn't even hate his style of humor. What bothered him was that Jerry had the platform, the influence, and the talent to do more, but chose to stay safe, to never dig deeper. And if there was ever a reminder of what Carson valued most in comedy, it came in the form of another comedian entirely. Someone Johnny considered his true spiritual successor. And it wasn't Jerry Seinfeld. If you really want to understand Johnny Carson's feelings about Jerry Seinfeld, you have to look at the comedian he did admire, Norm Macdonald. Carson almost never spoke publicly about other comedians after retiring. He kept to himself, rarely gave interviews, and didn't hand out praise easily. But Norm was different. Carson told close friends that Norm was the only comic who reminded him of himself. That's perhaps the highest compliment the king of late night could give. So, what was it about Norm that struck such a chord with Johnny? Norm wasn't polished in the way Seinfeld was. In fact, he was the opposite. His delivery was slow, sometimes awkward, often punctuated by long pauses that seemed like they'd never end. His jokes could bomb, sometimes spectacularly. But Norm didn't care. That was the point. He was uncompromising. authentic, and fearless. He told jokes the way he wanted to tell them, even if it meant losing the audience. To Carson, that was real comedy. Not about pleasing everyone, not about playing it safe, but about staying true to your voice, no matter the cost. Johnny appreciated comedians who took risks. One friend explained, Norm wasn't afraid to fall flat because he knew that when he hit, it was unforgettable. That honesty mattered more to Johnny than polish ever did, and it wasn't just the style, it was the spirit. Norm's comedy often carried a sly, dry wisdom beneath the surface. He could deliver a joke that sounded absurd, only for you to realize, minutes later, it was pointing at something profound. That's the kind of layered humor Carson believed separated great comedians from the rest. Jerry Seinfeld, on the other hand, represented the opposite: careful, controlled, never stepping outside the safe zone. Where Norm embraced the risk of failure, Jerry built his career on avoiding it. That contrast became even more glaring after Norm's passing in 2021. When the comedy world lost Norm Macdonald after his private 9-year battle with cancer, tributes poured in. From David Letterman to Conan O'Brien to Adam Sandler, comedians across generations publicly honored him. Fans flooded social media with clips of his legendary moments, from his fearless jokes on Weekend Update to his infamous roast of Bob Saget. But one voice was noticeably absent: Jerry Seinfeld's. Jerry said nothing. Not a tweet, not a statement, not even a brief acknowledgement. This silence shocked many, especially since Norm had actually appeared on Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee just a few years earlier. They had sat together, shared laughs, and talked about the craft. Yet when Norm died, Jerry didn't say a word. To the casual fan, maybe that didn't matter. But to the comedy community, and especially to those who knew Carson's values, it spoke volumes. A veteran comedian who had worked with both men put it this way: Johnny always said you could judge a comedian's character by how they talk about other comedians. So by that measure, Jerry's silence said everything. If Carson had still been alive, he would have seen that silence as confirmation of what he always believed about Jerry, that beneath the polish, beneath the success, there was a lack of generosity, a lack of humility, a lack of respect for the craft and the people who came before. Meanwhile, Carson's admiration for Norm only grew in hindsight. To Johnny, Norm embodied the tradition of comedy that mattered most: fearless, honest, and connected to something deeper. He wasn't just funny, he was real. And that's what Carson valued more than anything. So when people ask why Carson disliked Jerry Seinfeld so much, the answer isn't just about scandals, arrogance, or wealth. It's about philosophy. Jerry represented a new era of comedy: safe, detached, and brand-driven. Norm represented the old guard: authentic, risky, and timeless. And in Johnny Carson's world, there was no question which one deserved respect. The feud between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld was never an open war. There were no public jabs, no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations caught on camera. It was quieter than that, almost invisible to the casual fan. But behind the scenes, it was one of the most telling rivalries in entertainment history. Because this wasn't just about two comedians, it was about two eras colliding. Carson came from a time when fame carried responsibilities, when being a star meant not just making people laugh, but also representing a certain standard of dignity. He believed comedy was about connection, about reaching into people's lives, reflecting their struggles, and helping them feel seen. For him, laughter was never just a distraction. It was a bridge. Seinfeld, by contrast, came to symbolize a different kind of comedy: detached, polished, observational, but deliberately shallow. He built his empire on the idea of a show about nothing, and in many ways, he embodied that philosophy off stage too. For Carson, that emptiness was unforgivable. The scandals, the arrogance, the flaunting of wealth, those were red flags, yes. But at the core, Carson's problem with Seinfeld was philosophical. Jerry represented the new kind of celebrity: massive success without responsibility. You're technically flawless, but spiritually empty. And perhaps the most brutal truth of all is that Carson didn't need to cancel Jerry or publicly tear him down. His silence was enough. Unlike countless comedians who earned Carson's legendary invitation to sit on the couch, Jerry never got that moment, and in the world of comedy, that absence spoke louder than words. Both men left legacies, but of very different kinds. Carson ruled late night for 30 years, becoming one of the most trusted figures in America. Seinfeld created what many still call the greatest sitcom of all time, and built a fortune that comedians before him couldn't have imagined. But even with all his success, Jerry never got the one thing that mattered most in comedy circles: Johnny Carson's blessing. So the question lingers: which approach stands the test of time? Is it Carson's vision of comedy, warm, inclusive, and deeply human? Or is it Seinfeld's, sharp, detached, and all about the punchline? The truth might depend on what you value most. Do you want comedy that unites people, that makes you laugh and feel? Or do you want comedy that entertains without ever demanding too much from you? As Carson once said, there are comedians who make you laugh until you cry, and there are comedians who make you laugh until you think. The great ones do both, and in his eyes, Jerry Seinfeld never did.